Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever you are in the world. Today is a special session, and as you know, we are your global gals, your pathway or gateway to doing business worldwide successfully and hassle free. Today, we have a special guest. Before that, I just like to share something with you, and maybe you can relate in my field. When I ask how many languages do I speak, usually I get two reactions depending on the answer. There are days when my answer is I speak 7 languages. The reaction is they're impressed. Wow, that's impressive. Or, whoo, I better watch what we say around you, as if I were going to chastise them for using a naughty word or producing a grammatical sentence. But there are days when my brain is not really functioning well, and my answer, okay, I speak too. The reaction is that they tend to send me a signal, a mixture of pity and encouragement, as if they wanted to tell me, well, Mona G, if you keep working at it, keep working hard, you learn another language. But all jokes aside, it seems that in our world, especially today, language is, it seems to be, for a large number of people, seems to be a barrier that divides groups of people and keep us all apart. And I believe, however, that language is not a barrier. It is rather a bridge, because it provides us with the lenses we need to understand one another and to communicate and learn about each other and other cultures. Heck, that's how I met my husband. If I did not speak his language, I would not have been able to communicate with him. For this, we have an expert in language. There are so many things that she does that I do not want to mess it up. So I am going to let her tell us about herself. Her name is Christine Mullaney from Spain. She's out of Spain right now. Irish origin, right, Christine? Go ahead.
Very Irish.
Introduce yourself, please, and we'll dive right into the subject of your expertise on languages and the usage of languages.
Thank you very much. I'll pull back a little bit on that if I can. I wouldn't say the use of languages. You're way more an expert than I am, being a polyglot with 7 languages under your belt. I have to be very honest. What I would say my expertise is the use of the English language and the use of our bodies, our voices, our minds, and our hearts to connect and communicate with other people. That's what I do. I teach people how to speak from their solar plexus, using all of the facets that we have on the inside and on the outside. Simply.
And how long
That's
have
simple.
you been, that's very simple. How long have you been doing this?
Truthfully, since I was 16, my mum was my speech and drama teacher. And I started training with her at the age of 7. And then once I turned 16, I was able to teach part-time with her. So I started teaching with her part-time. And from 1997, she started her own, we call it a feis in Ireland. So feis comes from the Irish language, and it means festival or competitive festival. So she started a speech and drama feis. So every year for over 20 years, we had up on 1,000 entrants coming in, standing on stage to perform in drama, poetry, mime, improvisation, a variety of different techniques, sight reading, and we trained them. A lot of them, of course, came from Mum's variety of schools that she taught in all throughout our parish and our county. So at 16, I started with it, but there's been a lot of meandering, different qualifications, different experiences, and different jobs since.
That reminds me of the movie The King's Speech about Queen Elizabeth's father.
Yeah.
And how he struggled with a bit of a stammer. Is that kind of what you do?
To a degree. I wouldn't call myself a speech and language therapist. I did shadow some speech and language therapists for a while because I thought I might go down that route. But yes, you can, as a speech and drama teacher, as a communication coach, in terms of the voice and the physiological aspect of things, help somebody work with a lisp, with a stammer, with different aspects of things. One of my clients actually is a PhD who's studying stammering across languages. Mona, might be very interesting for you, being so multilingual. So she studies people who stammer when they get into different languages and as they go through the point of fluency to where the bridges are breaking a little bit between the languages as they try to dampen one and light up another. It's fascinating what she studies.
There was a quote or a saying by Christopher McCormick, and he was talking about the aspect of language. And he said the best aspect of language learning as it teaches us humility, because trying to be yourself in another language strips your personality down to its most basic elements. I thought it was powerful. And I do know that you train several businesses, several professionals to work with other people or other countries speaking English, right? And of course, not everybody does speak English, but majority of the world, quite a bit, do speak English. What do you train them on? What's the method? What do you suggest for them to do?
I love what you said there about personality. Maybe it's for a different show. I'm not fluent in 7 languages, so you know more about that than I do in terms of personality. I have learned Polish. I lived in China for a year, Poland. I now live in Spain. And I'm not fully fluent in any of the languages, but I've learned enough to be able to communicate. I sort of argue against that loss of personality part. I get that idea that I can't communicate maybe what I need or want to communicate in the language, but my core never changes. But I'll answer your question. That's maybe a bit more philosophical of a conversation to have. My answer to that is it depends on the person. My model is called neuro-cultural communication. It doesn't exist yet, so the world doesn't really know what it is. Neuro-culture does exist, and there is a woman who, I think she operates out of America, who does do neuro-culture. But neuro-culture is really only in the last maybe 10 or 15 years being researched. And a lot of the research is being done in Japan, actually. It's very interesting. So what I do is help people to think about their thinking, first of all. I had an inquiry call last week and I asked the guy about how his mind saw things and thought about things. And he said, I've never actually thought about my thinking like that before. And that's the first step, self-awareness. So we do a SCARF assessment with the Neuro Leadership Institute, which is the human drivers of behavior. From that, we start off with them becoming aware of their own brains with a bit of self-awareness and brain awareness. We do some training on the understanding of what happens in the brain when we communicate. And then as we work through whatever their goals and needs are, because everybody's an individual, we bring them into this place where they're exploring themselves and others in a way they may never have done before. So looking at language awareness, what's the difference between me saying, do that now, and would you mind helping me do that? And to which culture and which person do I need to say, there are 15 facts that I need you to look at versus, wow, you're so intelligent. I can see why you're the leader of this company. We've got 2 different brains there, 2 different people that we need to communicate to. And then we layer that in with culture on top of it. And I don't do blanket culture. So we might say I'm Irish, but an Irish person from where I'm from is different to an Irish person from 20 minutes down the road from me.
Exactly.
There is no one block of anything.
So what do you look into, for example, say that you have a client from a corporation and perhaps they're on the fast track to become leaders. What are some of the elements that you have to consider? For example, if I need to present to stakeholders in the US versus Europe, especially if they're decision makers, and what are some of the elements of persuasion that I might have to take into account? Are those things that you touch upon as well?
Yeah, I actually have a podcast episode called How to Present to Executives. And I have a document that goes along with it, which I built based on conversations with CEOs that I had, firesides that I attended with executives, and Harvard research that has been published. Persuasion is an interesting thing. We can go back to Aristotle when we think about persuasion. And when I was studying it in one of my books, they didn't mention Aristotle, but it's the same thing. Again, we're looking at the human. We take the culture. So I have an American, but an American from Boston is not the same as an American from St. Louis. So I can say, you need to go in and present like this because they're an American. But if you don't look at the human that is behind the American, then your presentation might be completely off point. So what we look at is, what's their brain like, right? You've worked with them. If you haven't worked with them, go to somebody who has, one of their peers, one of the people who's on their team, find out a little bit about them. Google them, LinkedIn, check them. Look for something that you learn about the human. And when we find the human, then we find the driver behind the way the human thinks. Maybe that person, that executive is on a fast track too. And maybe they want to be made look good in the presentation. And if you make them look good in the presentation and you demonstrate how their work has influenced you, and as a team, then you have influenced the organization, you not only show your position and how you can bring more to the organization, but you show how you've all done it together. Because no executive wants to think that you're going to come up and scupper them. They want you to be part of the team and part of the organization.
If I could follow up on that question. So you talked about persuasion. Would you recommend, for example, to say, you might want to use a little more pathos instead of the ethos or the logos when you're using your persuasion? Because I've had Europeans say to me in presentation skills training, it seems that the Americans are looking a little bit more for the emotional connection, the pathos. They seem a little over the top at times. They're looking for the storytelling. Can you speak to that at all?
Oh, we do that. Oh, yeah. I actually wrote a comment on a LinkedIn article about this yesterday. We look at emotion, we look at rationale, we look at ethics, but it's not just about saying that's an American, you need to add in storytelling, because that American might be influenced by Polish background and they might be completely uninterested in storytelling and just want to know the data and the figures. They might be autistic. Maybe they're not interested in stories and they can't follow a story. Maybe they don't know from your body language how you feel or what you're trying to display because you're being too high context, we might call it, in culture. So yes, of course, I mean, I'm Irish. I'm bred in storytelling. It falls out off my mouth before I even realize I'm telling stories. And maybe I can use a story actually to demonstrate this. So I do work with a big tech company in America, and it's with their European and APAC teams and people on those teams that I've worked with. And I'm very grateful to my original client for trusting me so much to take me in and work with them. And I worked with one person from Italy. So in Italy, we have principles first, right? When we think about the culture map. So the Italians are coming in there and they're going to tell you everything, all about the whole lot. Bullet points, why? And and stories, yeah, I'm going to tell you stories, but they'll go all the way around here before we get back here, and then we'll be at the dinner table. So you have an executive that says, right, there's 7 minutes and there's a purpose and a point to this, and I need to understand and learn what it is. So what happened in those sessions, we did about 4 hours of sessions, was we flipped everything from going in with all of the principles and this is why this will work and why it should be done, to a picture of the two founders of the organization. And there's the backstory of that organization is incredible, really. Like, if I see that move in my voice there, it's really, I can't say it because obviously for confidentiality purposes, but they're, it's such an incredible mix and really people first focused organization that when we took in their story first, we then looped all of the examples from the customers with the data from that story and how it demonstrated all of the values of the organization, to finishing again with the CEO and a comment that the CEO had made at a talk. So threading with stories is essential, but as you say, it depends on who you're speaking to.
Very interesting, and I appreciate you sharing this with us. One thing that I was thinking about when you mentioned never use the blanket, this is American or Irish, whatever, and that's very much true. Same thing where I come from. I am from a city that if you go down just about 20 minutes away or a half hour, the culture is quite different. And personality makes all the difference. For example, when I'm working with someone, personality profile is a must-do assessment. And usually I used to have heavy on disc assessment, but now for about over a year or so, I shifted to bank codes, and it's very helpful because it helps you analyze the personality from the culture perspective and from the individual perspective. However, sometimes when we are doing it from the individual perspective and not knowing so much about the culture, it can be deviating because you have to understand the personality, the kind of personality you are dealing with relative to which culture they're operating from. because what I've noticed, and I can be wrong, but what I've noticed is the culture has a huge influence on which personality you're dealing with. So they come both together, they work hand in hand, the culture profile and the personality profile. Just a comment that I want to throw out there, because we cannot say all Italians do it this way or all Americans do it this way. You just have to narrow it down. Yes, there is a national culture that we have to be aware of, but the person that you're working with, if you don't understand their tendencies, their preferences, their nature, the way they think, the way they perceive things, the way they make decisions, even with noise, too much speaking. Okay, how much do I need to speak? How little do I need to speak? When do I need to speak? All of that is essential to successful business dealing. So,
yeah, you make a great comment there. It's two things to jump on. A little quick one on what you said at the end, because it's an aspect of the work I do. There are vocal cues. Now, again, if you're neurodivergent, you're not necessarily going to be able to pick up on these, but something like even the duration of a pause at the end of a drop in the voice indicates where somebody is almost finished or completely finished, and it's the next person's turn. So I demonstrated it there. The pause with the comma, what we might imagine was a comma, was slightly shorter than the end pause, demonstrating that I was finished with that thought. They're the tiny little nuances that people overlook when it comes to learning communication and training in conversations. Those little inflections of the voice when someone says, oh, that means something. But people don't think about what they mean and they don't study what they mean. But when you start to look at them and you realize, oh, that O wasn't a good O. No, probably wasn't. All right, okay, what do I need to do with that? Well, let's think about it. But going back to the personality things, I'll be very honest and say I really don't like them. I never have. Go so far as to say completely and utterly against personality testing. I've done them. I've had my disc done. What they do, and I understand, I don't want to knock what you do, and I actually don't know bank codes at all, Mona-Lou, so maybe I am yet to be convinced. But what I have experienced with things like DISC and Myers-Briggs and other things like that is a boxing in. And we do automatically in the brain categorize. We have certain areas of our brain which hold math information, so societal information, musical information. There are different parts of our brains that hold those pieces, and then they blend all together to allow us to communicate. So we have to categorize to keep ourselves safe and to be able to pull our mental maps together to understand a person or to understand a situation. Am I safe? Am I not? Well, there's fire. Probably not. As a very base example. But with the personality assessments, I've had people say to me, well, you're like this, so, that's natural. And inside, when somebody says that to me, well, that's what you are, because you showed up as a bit more, what color was it? Green, I don't know, or blue. That
color.
Yeah, you're this. And as soon as someone says the words to me, you're this, I'm like, oh,
yeah, it's
I'm
annoying.
going to talk to you about Tony DeMello now. It is. It's that decision that you're this, but you're not. In that moment, you might have had your heart broken that morning, and today you're feeling yellow. And then an hour later, someone makes a comment that you really didn't expect them to make, and it lights you up. And so you feel a little more of another color. And it brings me on then to a different type of assessment, which I haven't looked at, but what's the name of them? They're energy based, and they do use the colors, but they don't use them in terms of profiling somebody as something. They use it as an energy. So you tend to have a red energy. We need to dial up the red on this one because we have to get this done before yesterday. And so there's dialing up and dialing down of energy in people and blending and mixing teams in that way, as opposed to deciding that a person is this all the time. And finally, I agree with what you said, Mona-Lou, 1,000,000%. Although the data heads out there are now like, you can't have 1,000,000%. I'm being emphatic. Culture. I think, honestly, that culture is a greater driver of the human than anything else. Of course, trauma and life experience comes in there, but when you get to know cultures and you live in different parts of the world, you meet people from different places, you realize so much about yourself. And then, of course, you understand so much more about other people.
You said something a moment ago. The whole, I guess, communication intelligence of knowing when to jump in, when to make a pause. Doesn't that also vary by culture? And this is why I ask, because, for example, I've noticed American kids, when they're little, it's hard for them to know when their parents say, don't interrupt when people are speaking, which I noticed that in the US, it was more of a big deal than in Latin America. Kids were allowed to interrupt all the time. And usually when they're 4 or 5, they don't know when those pauses come in. It takes a while to learn those particularities. And I also noticed that in some cultures, it's okay to interrupt people mid-sentence, and in others, it's not so cool. You do have to have that ear and know when it's your turn. So is that something that also varies? Like you just said, cultures vary. There's certain particularities, and knowing in this culture what is acceptable or how much you can interrupt. Whereas in this culture, that's kind of a taboo. Don't do it. Just wait until there's this inflection before you jump in. Do you work with your clients in that specific particularity as well?
Absolutely. And I think Mona-Lou will know about this one as well. It's part of the Culture Active program that we're both trained in, the interruptive nature of different cultures, we might say. Last year, somehow, I'm not sure how it happened, but in a week, I ended up on 4 different phone calls with 4 different South Africans, all from what we might call, and I hate doing these separations, right? But they exist. So the white South African with German descendancy.
Yeah.
And I always, before I go on to a call with anybody, with the exception of you ladies, actually, but most of the time, if I'm going on to a new call or an inquiry, I'll actually look at the culture profile of the nationality that I'm going in to speak to and have a look at them and think about the way to communicate with them best. So I went into South Africa and it was like, interruptive. You need to be able to interrupt. And it's true. It was so difficult for me. I'm not an interrupter. I lived in China for a year. In Ireland, we want to interrupt and we're sitting there and we're chomping at the bit, we might say, like a horse with the bit in its mouth, but we don't, because we afford the person the respect of being listened to. And so I had to interrupt if I wanted to be heard. And it was like tearing through somebody's voice. Well, and that's, I think, really important. It happens to me in interviews as well when people are asking me about this kind of thing, because I don't like to speak this much at length. I like everybody to have a turn. It's part of who I am. The feeling, that discomfort that we get, this comes in with public speaking fear, with presentation fear. The higher we move up the different ranks, it changes. I'm fine now at this level. I feel confident. Oh, wait, what? You want me to present to the executive team? Oh, no, I feel like I'm here again. And it's just the blip. It's that rebound of back into a new degree of confidence. But the discomfort that comes, I used a gravitational wave to describe it when I did my TEDx talk. In a gravitational wave, before there's an expansion, there's a contraction. And it's actually the same in the brain. So we can use that as an insight. Have you ever, and listeners, people who are watching this, think about this for yourselves. That moment just before an idea hits and it's coming. You can feel it coming when you're about to have an idea or a breakthrough. Have you ever felt that moment?
Well,
it just happens. It's like asking if you have an aura before you have
Well, next time, reflect a little bit, because what happens is there is a shift in your eyes. So you naturally and automatically, you look down or you look away. So you reduce the push of the stimulus on your visual cortex, and that reduces the pressure on the brain. It allows you to look inward. And then when you do that, a little energetic wave happens and there's a burst into gamma waves, those top brain waves that we have, the explosion of the eureka or the aha, as we all know it. And then we drop back down into these alpha waves. So there's a contraction, a little bit of a tame off, like a tsunami. The sea contracts back. Everything is the same. It all exists across all different types of energy. It pulls back and then poof, it expands. And fear is exactly the same. So when we feel the fear, contract, wait a minute. If I'm like a tsunami or if I'm like an idea, or if I'm like a wave, I can pull back here and then I can just poof. And the power that comes after that fear, that's where everything lies. That's the growth.
I love that analogy. That's
I love that too. I have to start looking into this and paying attention at every stage before a certain feeling, or like you said, an idea or fear. That's very interesting. Now, I have a question in regard to the power of listening. We just spoke about interruption and all that. But the power of listening relative to real comprehension of what one wants to say.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see in your practice? I mean, you're talking to executives, you are coaching senior levels and talking to clients from all over the world. How does listening come to play when you want to make your point, your point across?
Great question. And again, I have another podcast episode on this, the power of listening. I have a follow-up to do. I think it's a bit of an adage now, or an adage, how do you pronounce it? That people say you listen to hear or you listen to respond. And that's the question that's asked of people. What are you doing? Are you listening to respond or are you listening to hear? I think that's the key thing to first think about. When I'm afraid of what I'm going to say, when I'm afraid of looking bad, when I'm afraid of making a mistake, when I'm afraid of being judged, who am I focused on? It's all about me. So I'm not listening. I'm paying attention to myself and making myself look good. So if I can flip that focus and just take it away from me and just make it all about the person. We say in brain-based coaching, you listen for potential. So when you're listening to a person speak, listen for the potential in their words. What's coming from them that demonstrates them as a human and their potential. And when they're finished, usually in the coaching process, we would ask permission to respond in a particular way, especially if we want to ask a challenging question. We might, well, something's coming up for me there. May I share it? Or where do we want to go with this next part of the conversation? When you're coaching, but with executives, I would deal more with mid-level. Mm-hmm. I've just begun working with some startups, and the startups that I'm working with are the owners of their startups. That resonates more with me to an extent because my master's is in entrepreneurship. So I understand the theoretical side and I'm running my own business, but it doesn't really matter. A startup and the owner of a startup is communicating with CEOs of other organizations. They're going to be their clients. One of the key things is that learning to listen, to sit back and, okay, I'm here to hear what you have to say. And recognizing when an emotion hits that makes them want to respond while the person is speaking, where that's coming from. Because there's so much. I mean, you know about ACEs being over in America, the adverse childhood experiences, and so many people have them and have numbers of them, but aren't aware of them. So when an executive, say, in an organization is a man and a woman comes in and her voice is too high and she doesn't stop talking, at some point he's just going to switch off, likely. Not for definite. Obviously, it depends on the work that he's done on himself. But what they don't realize is that the reason I'm switching off is because she reminds me of my wife or my daughter or a teacher that annoyed me or a parent or somebody. And it's triggered an emotion or a response from something that was 20 years ago. But that 20 years ago, I heard it called an echo today, which is a beautiful way to describe it. When that echo reverberates inside us, if we're not aware of it, it becomes part of the present conversation. And then there may be no communication. So listening is different across cultures. And again, I feel like I've talked at too much length here. But if you think about in where you are, if you're in a room with other people, how long do you listen for before you interrupt?
Well, if you're asking me the question, it has been an evolution, put it that way. An evolution that I am noticing in myself because, as you know, I come from multi-active culture where you are sitting in a room and everybody's talking at the same time and nobody's hearing anybody. Everybody wants to get their ideas across and there's lively conversations going on, but at the end of the day, you don't know what anybody was saying or trying to convey. But then, as I have worked on myself, being in the speaking field and the listening field. And I found that listening is a huge part of communication.
Hmm.
Now, I am more conscious as I work with clients from all over the world. And throughout the years, I've been in sales. And sales, obviously, the ultimate result is what? Is do business, closing that transaction or ending in successful resolution. And I had to learn the listening skills or the listening criterias of so many cultures. Because when I am listening or when I'm speaking, I'm asking myself, are they listening to me? Or they're thinking about something just to come back to reject or throw that rejection or objection back to me. So that is, like I said, is a training in process, is an evolution, is a progress and or work in progress all the time. But I am very highly conscious of when I speak, when is someone else speaking to me, when I am listening and being listened to, because you just have to understand these little details. Sometimes we don't pay attention to them. And when we are born in a culture, nobody really gives us the roadmap to that culture. Okay, well, here's your just like when you become a mother, nobody's giving is giving us a roadmap on how to raise that child. At least back when I had my first daughter 26 years ago, and I was just figuring things out. Or I am taking bits from my culture, my mother, how did my grandmother did it? But then I realized that the way my grandmother or my mother did it is not the way I should be doing it here in the United States within, okay, well, in nowadays being in parallel or in progression with what's happening in the world today. So there's got to be a mind shift. There's got to be some process of and learning to do it the right way. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, unlearning is a key word there. Maria, you mentioned you're in the States, but you had spent some time in Latin America as well. Is that right?
Yes, my background, I'm American. My parents, Cubans, who immigrated to the US back in the day of the Cuban Revolution. But I was an expat's child, so I lived abroad for 10 years growing up and then eventually settled in Mexico, and my children are half Mexican. I'm one of these people that, what they call third culture kid, who, when you ask them where are you from, it's not a very easy answer.
Oh.
So that was my whole context there. So
super.
Yes, and my Cuban family is probably very much like Mona's family, where everybody would yell over each other, and whoever yelled the loudest got the floor.
But I think that's an interesting one as well, because now we're into family culture, and that's different to national culture. So I have two families. Let's say my parents divorced when I was very young. And I have my dad and his wife, and they have a son who's 17 years younger than me. And then I have my mum's side, where, when we're talking context now, you want to get complicated. Let's just say there are 3 boys and 3 girls, but there are steps all over the place, and it's a bit complicated.
Mine, yours, ours.
Exactly. So when we're in one family, there's one culture, and when we're in another, there's another culture. And those cultures of communication vary and shift, exactly like Mona said, and have done as we've got older, as we've lived in different countries, because we've all actually lived outside the country now, bar one of the boys. And then as my sisters had their children, the communication has changed. But you'll definitely come into our kitchen at Christmas time and hear a lot of noise. Sometimes so much that I'm gone. I'm quite quiet. Yeah. I can be loud and talkative, but I prefer smaller groups, even more intimate, 1 or 2 people. This is lovely, where there isn't a huge amount of crazy energy and I can feel balanced and have a proper conversation.
Are you sure it's not because you're green?
Oh,
I'm just teasing you.
I know.
I know we're getting off topic here. We're probably winding down, but I'm just kidding. Pulling your leg.
I'm in fact enjoying this conversation. I wish we had all day to talk about this, because it's a quite interesting when we think about it. How were we raised, or how were we accustomed in doing things? And when we are moving around the world and dealing with different people, we realize, okay, there are thousands of ways of doing this. We can have an agreement over something, but the route to take to get to that agreement can be so many routes. And we just have to understand those, not just for us to have a successful business, but for us to have peace of mind while we are doing business or having an interaction with somebody. Because at the end of the day, we all want hassle-free process with anything we do. Who likes complications? Nobody does. And well,
no, I'm not very simple. I'm a bit of a complicated soul. But I think if I can say, it's also how we look at what hassle is. It's like calling a woman difficult. And I would say to you, yeah, I am difficult, if that's what you want to call me. But when I say I'm difficult, it means that I challenge things, that I'm not afraid to say, I don't think that's the way that we could do that. I think there's something we could do differently. And hassle can be given a negative connotation. But when there's hassle, there's friction. And when there's friction, something isn't working right. And that gives you the opportunity to smooth it out and move through it to find the result. But I know you do hassle-free. And of course, if life could be hassle-free for everybody, I don't even understand how that could happen to me. It'd be a dream. Ladies, how are you going to do that for me? That'll be fabulous.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, when I say hassle-free, I get it. The friction. When there's hassle, there's friction. But for me, why would I get to the friction while I can work on it prior to that by weaponizing myself with tools and skills and strategies to get me to what I need, or what I need to get, or where I need to go, hassle free.
Yeah.
So that's a matter of a preparation beforehand to get to where you want. And that's what I've been working on for years and years and years, because every interaction, I am not interested in any type friction, any type. But you do meet people with different personalities and different level of consciousness. Because when you were talking about the orange and all that, if you have ever done Tony Robbins, for example, he does talk about the 8 levels of consciousness. And I do meet people every day. I do meet people from every level. So when I am dealing with somebody in the red level or the orange, know ahead of time how to deal with these people. If I am in the blue or the turquoise, well, now you're starting to speak my language, and I will not have any difficulty getting along with you. But when I am looking at others, I do have to know how to deal with them. I do know that I will face objections, challenges that I will have to deal with, and I have to be prepared for dealing with those challenges. I mean, we can be talking about this a long day, but my goodness, you have quite a perspective on things. And I am quite honored to be having this conversation with you. I know you are packing and going back to Ireland.
Yes.
I hope you have a great summer and a great time. So final say, what do you think we should be doing to get to the results that we aim for as far as communication, as far as listening?
Well, I agree with you when you say prepare. Step into places where you feel really uncomfortable. Stay uncomfortable. Stick with that little bit of discomfort, because all the time that's going to help you move forwards just a little bit. Don't presume anything about anybody.
Yep.
When you see their color, maybe take them off, clean them, put them back on. Just see if something looks a little bit different, and get in touch with women like us who want to make your lives less full of hassle, but we'll give you a little bit of friction if it's necessary, just to push you forwards. I like a bit of friction sometimes. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Oh, thank
and
you.
Know that, sorry to cut across there, but know that listening is active. It is taught as a passive skill. And even in English language learning and teaching, listening is thought of as a passive skill. It's not. We can passively hear, like the dog that you can probably hear barking downstairs right now, who seems always to come when I go on a recording. Thank you, neighbour. But you can do nothing about hearing that dog. You've heard the bark without doing anything about it. But you can choose to pay attention to the bark, or you can choose to pay attention to what I'm saying. That's active listening. So thank you, dog.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's always a pleasure to have a fresh voice and different perspective on the show. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and have a wonderful time in Ireland.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate it.